Hi. So this is a video response to Kevin Burk's recent video on Horary Astrology. In the video, Kevin made the statement that Horary is one of the oldest branches of astrology. And I actually wanted to make a video just to correct this statement, because in point of fact, I believe, or I've made the argument in the past, that Horary is one of the youngest branches of astrology in the astrological tradition. So, I guess I wanted to take this moment just to present sort of a broader overview of what exactly are these branches of astrology, or what the four main branches of astrology are. The oldest branch of astrology that developed in Mesopotamia is, we refer to it as Mundane Astrology, which is the application of astrological principles or studies to groups of people, such as cities and nations. So this is the type of astrology that's used to study disasters or to study countries as a whole, and things of that nature. In Mesopotamia, this was how astrology first developed, because it was useful to the country as a whole, or to the rulers. From that, eventually, from this notion, this basic astrological premise that celestial objects or celestial movements correlate with earthly events, the basic astrological premise, developed probably the notion of electional astrology, which is the second branch of astrology. Electional astrology is the application of astrology to select auspicious dates in the future in order to begin new ventures or undertakings. So the premise is that if the planets and the stars correlate with events that are occurring on Earth right now, then by extension you should be able to pick or search for certain planetary alignments in the future that will be more conducive to certain types of ventures or certain types of undertakings, like a marriage or founding a city or starting a business or what have you. One of the most famous electional or examples of electional astrology is the foundation of Baghdad by a group of astrologers in the 8th century. So that's the second branch of astrology. The third branch in chronological order is natal astrology, which was developed sometime around the 5th century BC in Mesopotamia. This is the application of astrology to individuals. The basic premise is that the position of the stars and the planets at the moment of a person's birth have something significant to say about the nature and course of their life. This is probably the most successful branch of astrology over the past 2,000 years. So those were the three main branches for much of the early part of astrology's history, even during much of the Hellenistic period. But sometime around the 1st century CE, during the Hellenistic tradition of astrology, there was a subset of electional astrology that involved casting a chart for the beginning of a consultation between an astrologer and their client. And this is what's referred to in modern times as the Consultation Chart. The notion is that by casting the consultation chart, this would tell the astrologer something about what the consultation would be about, or specifically what was on the mind of the person who was coming to see them at that time. So the consultation chart basically depicts what the consultation will be about, because it's cast or set for the moment of the inception of the consultation. So in my research, I came to understand as I was working on this research project, trying to trace the history and origins of Horary astrology a few years ago, that this was likely the origin or the starting point for Horary astrology. That Horary, as the fourth branch of astrology that shows up in the medieval period, that Horary probably evolved out of this consultation chart framework. Once the astrologers figured out that they could cast a chart for the beginning of a consultation between themselves and their client, and that chart would depict what the nature of the consultation would be, or specifically what was on the mind of their client as they approached the astrologer for the consultation, they eventually took that and took it one step further and tried to figure out then what the eventuation of the thoughts or the subject on the client's mind would be. And that's how we got eventually the fourth branch of astrology, which is Horary Astrology, which, as Kevin already explained, Horary is the application of astrology to a specific question And what you do is you cast a chart, or an astrologer casts a chart for the moment that they receive a question from a client. And this chart depicts not only the nature of the question itself, but also the outcome of that question. So you can actually answer a question about the future based on the chart cast for the moment of the question itself, or more properly, the exchange of the question between the astrologer and the client. This form of astrology, where they're casting charts for the moment of a question and creating a specific technical and conceptual apparatus in order to interpret those questions, this doesn't really appear in the astrological tradition, in any of the astrological traditions, until sometime between the 5th and the 7th century AD, specifically in the Indian and Persian traditions. So it first appears in these traditions, and it's not clear if horary astrology was also practiced, if it also arose in the Hellenistic tradition at this time, in the late Hellenistic tradition. There may be some evidence of this, but the jury is still out as to whether or not horary astrology was practiced in the late Hellenistic tradition from the 5th century to the 7th century. It does appear to have been practiced in the Indian and Persian traditions at this point, and then eventually in the medieval Arabian tradition around the late 7th and early 8th century CE. These traditions get merged together, and basically horary becomes a major branch of the tradition. This is the point at which it becomes sort of officially the 4th branch of the astrological tradition. But back to my original point, that's kind of late in the astrological tradition. If horary only fully gets integrated into the tradition with the other 3 branches in the 8th century CE, then that does in fact make it one of the youngest branches of astrology, if we're using the categorization of 4 major branches, which is used by most historians, with all other applications of astrology essentially being subsets of those 4 branches. So in point of fact, I would simply like to point out that horary actually is probably the youngest branch of astrology.